Well, welcome everybody. Thank you all for coming. What an event we have tonight. My name is Paul Kyle. I have the privilege of representing Ed for Vancouver and hosting this exhibition. It's just so wonderful to have you. This evening is featuring, of course, a conversation between Ed Burtynsky and John O'Brian. This exhibition asks us to look closely at the world we have made, not in a simple or sentimental way, but with attention to beauty, consequence, scale, industry, landscape, and responsibility. Ed's photographs draw us in because they are visually astonishing, but they ask very serious questions about how we live on, use, alter, and imagine the earth. That is why it feels especially meaningful to have John O'Brian with us tonight. John is one of Canada's most distinguished historians, art historians, writers, curators, and teachers. He is Professor Emeritus of Art History at UBC, where he taught from 1987 to 2017, and where he held the Brenda and David McLean Chair in Canadian Studies. He also taught at York University, Harvard University, and Ritsumeikan University in Kyoto. And he has lectured widely across North America, Europe, Asia, Australia, and beyond. His scholarship has a remarkable range. He is the author or editor of more than 20 books, including major work on David Milne, Clement Greenberg, Canadian art, modernism, and the visual culture of the nuclear age. His edited volumes of Clement Greenberg, the collected essays and criticisms, were named a New York Times Notable Book of the Year. And his exhibition, Camera Atomica, at the Art Gallery of Ontario was the first major exhibition to examine the nuclear photography across the post-war period. John has also received many honors for his work. He is a Fellow of the Royal Society of Canada, received an honorary doctorate from Trinity College at the University of Toronto, was awarded the Thackeray Award in Human Rights and Peace Studies at Simon Fraser University, received a Lifetime Achievement Award for his contribution to visual arts, and most recently was awarded the Royal Canadian Academy of Arts Medal. And wonderfully, he also is indicted into the University Toronto Sports Hall of Fame, which means that tonight we have the rare pleasure of welcoming an art historian whose intellectual footwork is apparently matched by his actual footwork. What makes John such an ideal person to speak with Ed tonight is that his work has always understood images as more than just illustrations. Images are evidence, they are arguments, they are records of power, memory, beauty, anxiety, ambition, and history. That way of thinking feels especially important in relation to Ed's photographs, which ask us not to simply admire what we see, but to understand what we are seeing. So, we are deeply honored to have John with us tonight and very grateful to Ed for his extraordinary exhibition and for the many decades of looking, traveling, thinking, and making that have brought these works into the world. Please join me in welcoming John O'Brian and Edward Burtynsky.
Thank you, Paul. And welcome everybody to this remarkable exhibition. It is accompanied by a catalog, if you haven't seen it yet, with a probing, penetrating, insightful essay by Diamond Shaw, and I recommend reading that. And it has all the images that are here, or all the works that are here, are illustrated in that catalog. My introduction to Ed will be much shorter than Paul's introduction to me, because he doesn't need an introduction. He's the man of the moment. His project can be summarized in a variety of ways, but one sentence would be to say that he is interested, as you see in these works, over this 40-year period, in which these works cover a 40-year period, of the collective human impact through global industry on the surface of the planet. And the titles of his shows, such as Oil, Water, The Anthropocene, Extraction, Abstraction, and others, point directly to this project. And I want to quote briefly from Bill McKibben. Bill McKibben is the great geologist and chronicler of climate change in the world these days, in words. And he thinks that Ed is the equivalent to himself, although he doesn't say this, in the visual field. He says there is no greater visual chronicler of the planet than Ed Burtynsky, which is a remarkable thing to say because there are lots of people who are also in your camp, not as many as we might like perhaps, but it is it's a remarkable thing to say. And he goes on to say that it's a poetics of space that Ed Burtynsky deals with, and that he has developed the perfect depth of field for his project, for his task, which I think is an insightful comment. I mentioned to Ed earlier that in the ancient Sumerian language, the word for love is the same as to measure the earth. And I found that applied directly to Ed Burtynsky's work because he measures the earth in what we're looking at here, and that is a measure of his depth of affection and concern for this planet that we live on. We're sitting, we're not standing, Ed, we're sitting with two works behind us that pretty much encompass from the beginning of this show to the end. So this remarkable work behind me was taken the photograph was taken in 1985. It is a BC subject. The last work in the show is a glacier, which is around the corner at the back, so we can't point to it, done in 2023, so that's pretty much 40 years. So this wonderful, this extraordinary work, which is directly behind Ed, will have to take its place. It's 2020. And my question to you, Ed, would be, as we sit here, what is the distance traveled between these works, this 40 years, this 35 years, the distance traveled, and how would you describe the task in both of them?
Thank you, John, and thank you for being here and doing the interview, and Paul and Diamond, thank you as well for organizing all this, and thank you all for coming out tonight. I know it's a beautiful day out there, and I recognize that it's a journey here, and thank you for making it here. The image behind me is something that I think is a key to understand the journey that I've taken, and although this is done in just during the period of COVID, so I unexpectedly ended up doing this project in March, April of 2020. I was planning to be in April. Of that same year, 2020. I was planning to be in Ethiopia to finish a project on Africa. That would have probably been my 11th trip to Africa to do the Africa Studies book. As it turned out, I couldn't go, and no one went anywhere, and we were all kind of locked down. But in that lockdown, I did it up, and you're familiar with the area up around just below Georgian Bay, in the Collingwood, Creemore area, and I had really started to define my own work back when I was a student at Ryerson. I fell in love with the 4x5 camera, and at that time, most of the art photography was black and white, 35 millimeter street photography. That was like the Gary Winogrand and the Robert Franks, and that was the aesthetic of the time, kind of 16 by 20, 11 by 14 prints, street photography. And I was really being pushed to try to go to that direction, but I love and I was taking an art program, but in the first year you do some commercial work, and we got to work with color, large format, and we were photographing. At that time, it was like a liquor bottle, and then we were also doing lighting and how to do lighting and all that. But it was that camera, working with that camera, just for me was a very profound moment. And then I said, I want to work in color and I want to do landscapes. And my teachers were going, what are you doing? You know, landscapes are sort of passé and color is a commercial medium. And I'm talking about 1977. But I was determined. So then I started taking that 405 camera out with color film. And I was studying the history of art, and I was studying the history of music and history of photography at that time, 76, 77. And it was out of that studying that I actually really kind of was really introduced and really got to look at the ABX movement and looking at the Jackson Pollocks and the Diebenkorns and that all-overness and no centrality to it and gesture and color and I was, and color field kind of ideas. And I was trying to figure out how can I go into nature, because I loved growing up in Canada, and you have nature. I don't have to tell you what you have here. You have some of the most amazing nature on the planet at your doorstep. And Northern Ontario was my doorstep, and I fell in love with it as well. John and I spoke about it, and you had a love affair with that landscape as well. It's a very beautiful landscape as well. Not as dramatic as BC, but I fell in love. I went fishing with my father and mushroom foraging, and the forest and going out in nature was really part of my growing up camping. And I never forgot that. I always loved that. There was something that connected me, and at first I couldn't really understand it, but at some point as I got a little older and I'd be canoeing along a granite outcrop with trees, knowing that this has looked the same for hundreds of thousands of years, that this is looking into deep geological time. And there was something about putting your place in the arc of time, that being in nature, if you look at it in a profound way, it tells you about your place in this moment in time, and you're experiencing nature as the beaver would have, 200,000 years ago or 400,000 years ago. So there was something of that geological time that I began to feel when I was in nature, and I wanted to speak to it. And then also in an image like this, I kept looking at the complexity of that, especially in the spring. So the snow's gone, the leaves haven't come in yet. The light is beautiful and clear at that time in the spring, and it was just that looking at the kind of depth of detail. There's nothing in the urban world that looks like this. Everything is finished surfaces, the pavement of the roads and the glass or the concrete or all of that. So we live in an urban, and most of our input is this kind of machined, finished surface, whether it's our cars and here is the most complex thing you'll ever look at. And to me, it was like staring into that was like almost staring into the matrix of my own mind, of the neural nets, of the vascular systems that are there that keep me alive. And here they are kind of, fully visible. It's almost looking at the inside out of what is going on in our own bodies to give us life, and that this life. And I also thought, because it was like I was looking around in the area, and the emerald ash borer was killing all the ash trees, and we were locked down from again from China. Both of them came from China, with COVID. And I'm thinking, like, we're so vulnerable, and yet this would be persistent. That this would persist through, even if we disappeared on the planet, this would still be persistent. This would still exist. And there was something about and the reason why I'm going at length about it is that profound attachment and love of that natural world is what finally made me understand the loss of what was happening. And so when I started looking at what we were doing to the planet, when I started seeing back in university, and we were looking at population growth, and I think when I was born, it was 2.8 billion people. We're now north of 8 billion, so it's almost, not quite, like 800 million per year. So we're on this hockey stick, growth of human population, the apex predator now at, 8 billion. And the things that we're doing through technology and how we're reshaping the planet. And so, again, going back in 1983, I saw these rail cuts. I was doing a rafting trip down the Thompson River, and I was looking at the canyon walls, and I see the rail cuts, and I'm looking at nature above the rail cut, and I'm immediately understand the potential that it has as a photograph. And then come back later after that trip, after seeing it, and then finding ways to, find positions on the other side of the Thompson Canyon to photograph across to shoot this. I'm now shooting with 4x5. This one took me several days. I just waited for the light, and I was waiting for the light, and then this train came along, almost a serendipitous moment where the cargo within the train is the same color as a mountain. And I was reading Pierre Berton's The Last Spike, and just really just trying to get my head into how quickly we've come to the West and how rapidly we've now transformed it into a human, environment, and how humans have settled it. And so homesteads, mining, and also some logging and rail cuts became the subject matter of that 1983 trip. And then I just kept going from that point on. I understood I just could keep doing this, that this is a lifetime's work. And in many ways, it is a meditation. I think the whole body of work is a meditation and a lament for our success in the loss of nature, that is built into every image that I'm making, is that this story to talk about how we are overpowering nature.
I'm told that to take this photograph, and this is from the exhibition that was at the ICP in New York last year, where some of the photographs were taken of you and included in there in a small vitrine. You had to rope yourself to a tree to secure yourself while taking this photograph so you didn't go tumbling down the bank. Is that true?
Regularly, yeah. Whether it was on the other side of this canyon, I was tying myself to trees, or if I was doing quarries, when I did the quarry series, I would go in there on my own. So they would just say, go, but you're always standing, and where I'd want to stand is all like loose rock, and it's just all been fractured, and it's unstable, but I'd be going as far as I can go. So if I was going to a place where my mother wouldn't kind of approve, I would I had a harness, and I would tie myself either to a rock or to a tree. So if I went over, I'd be hanging there screaming, but I wouldn't be at the bottom of the quarry. So there was self-preservation in my work, so I'm still here. All digits, everything.
But there was a choreography to this. And just as there's a choreography of Jackson Pollock doing his all-over painting that you referred to in relationship to this. And I was here last night for an early opening, and I kept, when speaking to Landon McKenzie and a number of other people I see, I kept referring to paintings rather than photographs. And I couldn't stop myself doing it because they're so painterly. So I look at this, and it is painterly, by your own admission, looking at Pollock. Or this extraordinary photograph of a dam on the Yellow River, where as in the push me, pull you effect and the poetics of space that you have, I stand back and I get the overall, but as I come closer, I'm more and more convinced that, that it's the hand of a painter that is there rather than the camera that has done it. This makes me ask, could you say more about your relationship to painting?
Well, it's interesting because, and I didn't know this as I was growing up, and my father died when I was quite young. I was 15. But by the age of 6 or 7, he was a frustrated artist, and he ended up, and I actually learned just recently in the last year that he came from a town in Ukraine called Kosiv in the Carpathian Mountains. And we used to always get these boxes at Christmas, and we'd open them up, and there were just these beautiful handcrafted things, whether it was Easter eggs or whether it was wooden carving, instruments, all kinds of things that we would get. And I just thought that everybody got them from Ukraine because that's what they did there. But what I realized was, that the town where my father came from, everybody was artisanal. Everybody was making something. And my father's family was painters, and they painted ceramics, and then they that would end up being backsplashes for stoves and for kitchens, and they were hand painted ceramics. My father's family owned a ceramics company, and I didn't realize how important it was. But my father was always a maker, and I didn't know that because I didn't have any cousins, I didn't have any uncles. They came from the war, and then I was born in 1955. They came to the area in 1950, and they're in the kind of St. Catharines area, and that's where I was born. And I, again, didn't know anybody, and I didn't know where my father came from, but he was always making art, and I was always, alongside him, and he'd always include me. So when he was painting paintings, I would make paintings, or if he was doing something with feathers or and I would always be making alongside him. So I was already, I literally had no choice. Plus I loved it. I loved making things. To me, I felt alive in this. So, when I, continued to look at photography, the big thing that happened was, like, I was frustrated. We're painting alongside my father, doing largely landscapes, because my friends would say, "Hey, it's a beautiful day, let's go and play." And I'd be, he wants me to finish up the sky or something, and I'd say, "Oh, I'll come in an hour." And then at 11, I get a camera. I'm 11 years old, I get a camera, and I run outside, and I realize in one click, I can do a landscape. And I went, wow, this is way easier. And so I just started working with a camera and just making pictures. Like I was trying to make paintings, I was trying to make pictures, and I was just completely, not trained, just running around. And the difference was that, unlike today, where we all have our iPhones and we can take a picture and the cost of making a picture is zero. Well, that wasn't the case when the camera, and this is like in the 60s, it was a family camera. You got pulled out on Sunday or weddings or special events, and film was expensive, and you didn't just go and run and take pictures of your dog or whatever, and here's a camera, go have fun. It wasn't that. No kids had that access. But when I got a camera at 11 and a bulk loader with 100-foot rolls of Triax, I can load up all I wanted. So I just was running around taking all the pictures that I ever wanted, and there was no restriction. And I just kept taking pictures of what would that look like as a picture? What would that look like as a picture? And I would just take them, and I'd take them and make contacts and print the best ones, and often take many, many pictures of one thing, and then one would emerge. And little did I know that I was just kind of naturally attenuating my eye to how to translate the world into pictures. And I never thought you could make a living at it. I always just thought it was just a hobby. And then it was later on in college that I did a night school course in photography, and the teacher, Archie Hood, looks at me and he looks at my assignments and says, you have a natural aptitude. Whatever you're doing, you're just so much farther ahead than all the other students. You should consider, pursuing an art career in photography. And I went, you can do that? And he goes, yeah, you can, go to Ryerson. And so it was it was an hour drive from Toronto. And I went to Ryerson, and with my portfolio that I did with him, I was accepted, and the rest is history.
Part of that history is developing the technological equipment to be able to do what you want to do.
You hold your legs, John, please.
My voice naturally carried, but it doesn't. Part of that history is that you developed over the years a range of, you paid a close attention to technological equipment that could help you achieve what you wanted to achieve. Can you talk a bit about that? Because I think that's a major part of your accomplishment.
Oh, mazel tov. Yeah, well, so once I started working with a 4x5 and large format cameras, and I'm a student, and even back then, it was very expensive to work with that material. And the lenses that you needed to get to do that work were in the thousands of dollars, and the cameras were in the $5,000s of dollars, and and this is back in the 80s, and I was just working in the summer jobs, and it was very challenging to own that stuff. At first, I had to take it from the cage at school, and then eventually, by third year, I bought my own camera, a Linhof Master Technica, which I then built my whole career on that one camera. But to me, it was this. I understood very quickly that in photography, the chain is as strong as its weakest link. So first you needed the subject, and it had to be the right light, and it had to have the right contrast, and be in the right kind of place for you to capture it on the film and get all the highlights and shadows and all of that. And I kind of learned the zone system, Ansel Adams zone system, and I was using that in black and white. I learned in black and white. I spent 12 years in black and white before I switched to color. I switched to color in 1979, but up until then, for 12 years from when I was 11, everything was black and white. But I honed my skills on black and white, and then I understood that you had to get, the light had to be right, and then you had to get the perfect exposure on your film to make sure your highlights drop in properly and your shadows do. And then you have the right developer, and they referred to it at school as the soup, and you build in all the right chemicals that are going to give you, and the temperatures, and you have to do time, agitation, and temperature were key components to getting the film right and making sure everything's, no streaking on the film and no problems. And then so optimum processing, and then you had to go into an enlarger. You needed a good light source. You needed a lens that was equal to the lens that you were photographing with, because you're going to reproject it onto paper. And then you had to get the contrast in the paper and all the chemistry for that perfect to get a perfect print. So there's a lot of steps that you had to kind of refine. So I was honed, and that was my training. And most photographers in the analog world trained on black and white and went through all of that to get good. And I remember, like in my first year at Ryerson, I had a great teacher, Rob Gubelar, and I was trying to get one print on this very expensive, it was called Agfa Petriga Rapid, really rich in silver. And by the time I got the final print, I'd gone through a whole pack of 25 of paper. And then he said, okay, you got it. But I had 25 duds to get there. So I really began to learn what a good print was and the kind of, what you needed to do to get there. And then, so that large format was a very kind of rigorous medium in which you approach slowly and thoughtfully. It's not off the hip like 35. You think of your picture and you kind of work your way into the picture with that camera. And it's always done on a tripod. You've got a hood over your head. The image is upside down. It's dim. You have to use a loop. I didn't even at that time have a Polaroid. Later I found a 4x5 Polaroid that you can then look at a negative on location and see if you're sharp in your corners and all that. But for the first 10 years of using that 4x5 camera, there was no pre-flight, in other words, to make sure I had it right. So you had to get it right, and then you find out if you got it when you processed your negative film later on. And then in 1985, after I graduated from school, I couldn't print anymore. And I looked at all the, I went and talked to a lot of teachers, and I talked to other photographers, and I was deciding what I wanted to do. Do I want to be a commercial photographer and do my art photography? And every time I saw somebody who showed promise, and I went and talked to them, they couldn't keep their art career. In other words, their commercial career always dragged them into becoming a commercial photographer, and then they just did their art on the side, and I realized that it didn't work. Like I didn't see anybody who succeeded in doing that. And then I also saw a lot of teachers who went full-time teaching also distance themselves and stopped doing their work, and often just got too exhausted by the teaching, and never pursued their careers. And nor did I want to do something that was totally disconnected from the medium, like working as a cook or a chef or in a restaurant or something like that, and then doing my work. Or so I decided to open a lab, a photo lab, in 1985, that with darkroom rentals that allowed all my buddies and myself to print on a really good processor. And what I did when I built it was I used the same thinking. I'm going to build this lab so that nobody can look at it and say there's a better lab that could ever be built. The best optics, the best enlarger, the best dark rooms, air-conditioned, dust-free, the best processor. Everything I could find was optimized to give you the best result. And I just, from that point on, every time I built, it was always to optimize at the highest level of what the medium can provide at that time. So the lab is still around, and for 40 years, manufacturers, whether it was Kodak or anybody, or camera or lens manufacturers, even in digital, they would then start coming to me with that and give me the latest equipment to test out, report back on, and do beta testing. I still beta test. I'm one of the beta testers for Epson printers, so I'll get the first Epson printers that haven't even been launched. They're still the kind of hand-built by the company, and they would give me one to then give reports back to them on how I like it and what's working and what's not with my team. I've had the same team now for almost 30 years, printing my work. So it is in that kind of rigorous. I've never moved off of that, and I think that's when you look at the prints and you see the kind of quality of it. It's because I've trained everybody and I've trained myself just to always be at that optimum level.
I want to go back to another beginning. 1/3, maybe a little bit more of this exhibition is of mines of one description or another. Potash mine in Russia back there, granite quarry. That's not a mine with the tires, but there's some of them are around the corner. Iron mine in Sudbury. It's a major subject of yours has been taking photographs in series of quarries and of other mines in Africa, China, and elsewhere. When did that interest in extractive industry and mining begin for you? Was there an incipient moment there that, because it's such a major part of your practice?
So, as I mentioned earlier, so my father died when I was 15, and my mother really didn't have any resource. So if I was going to go to post-secondary school, I had to figure it out myself. And I did a combination of grants, loans, to some degree, but mostly I was doing part-time work during the school year. I would take on part-time jobs, and in the summer I would look for what's the best paying jobs, and the best paying jobs were either like GM or Ford on the assembly lines or the production lines. But the other place where it really paid super well was in mining. So I went up to, just before I started at Ryerson, I needed to get a good camera. So the year before, I took a year off, to go out and earn some money. And I worked as an underground miner. And my friend, this is up in Red Lake, and my friend worked in an open pit iron mine. So at that time, I was able, and I saw a blast when I was there as well. So I was like 19 at the time and working underground. And that left a huge impression on me. And I realized how few people really understood where iron comes from. That you're driving around in a car, but you have no idea of the source of the materials of that car and the scale. They had at that time they had those trucks were like 200-ton trucks. They now make 400-ton trucks. The Euclids, the tires are about as 13 feet high, almost as high as these walls. That's one tire. Each tire, I think, I checked recently. Each tire costs $150,000 per tire. So it's $600,000 to do a tire change on one of those. So they're huge. They're 21 feet high. You walk up on a ladder, and the motor. I actually did a photogrammetry of one of the motors of a 400-ton truck, and it's a big diesel. I think it's a 16-cylinder motor, something in the 12,000 horsepower, and it's running a series of generators, power generators, because those wheels are generated with electricity, so they're like massive. These massive things that are moving 400 tons, and the machines that are filling these are moving 100 tons of material at a time into this. So 4 loads would fill up a 400-ton truck. So I was looking at this, going, there's this world, and you mentioned the idea of the sublime earlier, but when you think back to the Kantian version of the sublime, or think of Turner, and painting, like a Turner type, it was again the awe and the force of nature was the sublime, and we were diminished by it, and we were in awe and fearful of it, and but nature was the force in which we were in awe and diminished in the face of. And then when I went into these mines, I recognized that we are now in a technological sublime where we are the bit players in our own theater of our own making. And these machines and the internal combustion engine and the availability of immense amounts of oil to drive this machinery is what's allowing us to make this gigantic world And I also recognize that very few of us ever get to see it because you're not allowed in those places. You don't get to see the open pit mines. You don't get to see where these things come from. So even when I was working there, I always thought this would be very interesting to photograph because nobody really understands these worlds. And the camera, the large format camera with its detail, I always believed was this great medium through which to tell that story because it's so rich in detail. It's kind of like the ultimate realist tool that, like I dare any realist painter to paint that, or it might be like a decade before they're finished, because if you start looking in there, it's just like endless detail. And to me, that was the kind of magic. And to me, photography was always magic. I mean, when I was that little 11-year-old in the furnace room watching that image, my first image of a picture I took of my dog in the winter, jumping around, a whole roll of that, and then I watched it appear in this orange light in a dark room. It was like, oh my God, this is magic. This is like, to me, it was like I was hooked as a kid, and it still is to me this kind of amazing medium through which I can, take an image of the world and have it reappear, and it appears in a way that we can't see the world. Like we have like 8 degrees where we have high resolution. So when we read, or that fovea, it's an 8-degree window through which we're reading. So we're constantly, and so we're constantly using that part. Everything else gets softer to the edges. So when we look at reality, we have a sharp window and everything softens to the sides. We don't see the world that way. It's sharp from edge to edge, top to bottom, and we don't experience the world that way. So, and then when you close it off with a frame, you just kind of enter into a world in a whole other way. It creates, that framing creates a kind of a significance of that thing that you framed. And it was kind of understanding that, and I do, when with a 4x5 or an 8x10, I did feel like a painter facing a blank canvas. I was just facing a blank sheet of film, and I was trying to fill it in a way that would engage the viewer, with the image that I've captured. So to me, that going back in a long-winded way, painting was a deep thread that always naturally formed, and I just followed my instincts of wanting to continue that kind of way of thinking and looking at the world.
People have flown in. Am I off again? People have flown in, I'm told, to listen to Ed speak. And if somebody's flown in, they have a right to ask a question if they want. And so I would like to open this up with your permission, Ed.
Oh, sure, go ahead.
And take questions from the audience of any kind. There are no bad questions.
You can't ask me what kind of camera.
There are no bad questions or only bad answers.
You can't ask me what camera I use. It's the one that's adequate to the job. I just move around. This is a phase camera, 150 megapixel. Other ones are 100 megapixel. But I'll adapt the camera to the need. Sometimes I'll use a drone. But oftentimes there's a mistake that the camera's important. Like I'll always make sure it's of a high quality of optics. But the real, that same camera in different hands will be different, make different images. So I think it's like how any artist, would then take that tool and adapt it to their way of seeing or to their ideas. And so it is just, at the end of the day, it's still just a tool.
Over here at the back and then here.
Thank you. I wonder if you could talk about the ship-breaking yards in Chittagong. That was one of the first pictures of yours that I saw years ago that totally blew me away. And I'd like to hear more about, because I know politically it was hard to get into that place for a long time, and just how that worked for you.
Yeah, I mean, I think the ship-breaking photographs, which, by the way, all of that activity has now ceased. They've taken away all the licenses of small operators from breaking ships. When I was there was about 45 separate operators breaking these oil tankers by hand, basically in a cutting torch. Now there's a big company that's moved in, and they're just dragging them up and using more modern tools to break these ships. But at that time, it was pretty, phenomenal what I was able to witness. That was in 2000 and 2001 when I went. And what happened, and oftentimes people say, well, like, how did you get there, or why did you get there? What was the thing that triggered you to go? And it's interesting. It can come from anything. It was a radio program and ideas that I was listening to, and I think it was Paul Kennedy, and there was a discussion about the Exxon Valdez oil spill, which happened out here on the coast. And in the interview, there was an insurance person, somebody from the oil industry, and also an environmentalist, and then the host, and they're all going around talking about the scale of it. And what happened was and if you recall, it was in the late '90s when it happened, that oil tanker, the captain had been drinking and went off course and hit a rock or hit a shoal. And split open the oil tanker, and it was the worst kind of oil. It was thick, crude, gummy oil that then spilled out and covered 1,000 miles of shoreline, pristine shoreline, up in the north of BC. And the insurance company said that we understand, the representative, we understand that there's nothing that we can do at this point to prevent a human error like that to occur. I'm sure today with GPSs and going off course, there are ways to do it. But at that time, the captain could still kind of make an error and cause that to happen. And they said the only way to prevent that accident from ever happening again is to decommission single-hulled ships and only allow and insure double-hulled ships, and that's what they're going to do. And by 2004, all the single-hulled ships had to be decommissioned. I went, okay, these are the biggest things we built as human beings. These are the biggest vessels ever built. And I want to go to wherever they are being taken apart, because that would be an incredible world to see. So then I started researching, and then my original research took me to Alang in the Gujarat state in northern India. But there had been a Greenpeace group that, under false pretenses, went in there and did a smear campaign on them, and then all photographers were persona non grata, and they were bullying them, taking their cameras, pulling the film out, and just literally not letting anybody. This is around 2000 when I was trying to get in there, letting anybody go, and that was the very beginning of chat. And we went on it was called Thorntree, which is a Lonely Planet site, and we were able to talk to some people who were there by texting back and forth. But then somebody in the blog said, hey, I just came back from Chittagong, and the shipbreaking yards there are insane. They're really interesting. And it's the second largest place in which you can go and see ships of this scale being broken. So then my research took me to Chittagong in Bangladesh. And I have to say, it was like stepping back in time. There's no environmental regulation, no human rights. Life was cheap. The average length of life of anybody there was probably 30. Limbs were being lost daily. Eyes were being lost daily. It was average 2 deaths a day. There was like 700 deaths a year in these yards, and there was no regulation. And it was like stepping back into Charles Dickens' moment of the Satanic Mills. It was just like, I didn't think this world could exist, where guys are pounding away at a heat exchange unit to get the copper. But what they didn't understand is that it was asbestos that was floated in between it all to hold it together, and the dust cloud that they're in is asbestos. Or they're cutting through marine paint with no glasses and no respiration, masks on. And it's a half inch of marine paint over 50 years. That's been 8 coats of paint or something over time. And they're cutting through that marine paint. You can only imagine the fumes coming off of that. And the whole area, I was just at the end of every day, I was almost ill just from being there, from breathing the air. In fact, in the first time I went, I was there for 3 weeks, and 10 days in, I got strep throat, and I was out for 5 days, almost, like really in bad shape. That's why I went back after that. I went back and I realized I didn't finish the project because I got sick. And then I went back 3 months later and did another 3-week shoot there. And only later, I found out that that Sebastian Salgado had been there 10 years earlier, because somebody told me when I was there that there was a photographer here like 10 years ago. And I went, oh, okay. And then all of a sudden I saw these pictures of Salgado, and then I became friends with him. And he said, yeah, I went there. So he was there in 1990, and I was there in 2000. Yeah.
I was cheating. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about your transition from film to digital in 2006. What was sort of the impetus behind that?
Well, so I, in the lab, Toronto ImageWorks, it's now called Total ImageWorks. I merged with another lab, and we renamed it. But when I saw digital coming, I was already looking at digital film recorders. I opened up the lab in 1985, and I started researching digital film recorders in 1988. In 1991, I had opened up a digital lab in Toronto teaching Photoshop 2.5 on Quadra 800s. I remember it was ridiculous. I was buying RAM at $60 a meg. So I bought 460 megabytes of RAM for $36,000, and the computer only had 40 megabytes per computer of RAM. Everything took forever, and nothing worked. And it was a really kind of crazy idea to start that early, but I did. And it's interesting because the company was ImaPro, and what I realized is that actually, most people don't know this, but Canada invented digital photography in Ottawa. It was from the RadarSat, and were getting digital data down from a satellite and to do a remote sensing of the surface of the planet. And they needed to take digital data and convert it to an image. And the first film recorder that could do that was built in Ottawa. And so people understand that we invented digital photography in this country. And the guy who was at the forefront of it had a film recorder that I bought from him in 1990 for $80,000 to write, to be able to get an image, do some work with Photoshop on the image, and then write it back out onto a 4x5 piece of film, and then take that negative film and put it in enlarger and enlarge it. So that's how I started in 1992. I was also teaching Photoshop. But there was no digital cameras that matched what film was. Like I was doing 4x5, and at that time I was already at an 8x10. So when I'm shooting that diptych over there is shot 8x10. That's an 8x10 image, and what else is here 8x10? I think that's the only 8x10 pair of images on the tire piles. Everything else is 4x5 or digital. So so then it was like I pretty much stuck with film, and then in 2003, I wanted to try I was doing a project on oil, and I tried to get up and photograph the LA freeways with a helicopter, the 405 and the 110. And I went up with my 4x5 camera and rented a helicopter in 2003, and it was really a hit and miss, and I was like really hard to get an image to work. I couldn't frame it properly. It was slow. They were blurred. They weren't, I couldn't, see the composition properly. And so I kind of realized, well, that's not going to work. And then I tried a 2.25 film camera, Hasselblad with a fast lens, and the 2.25 film, when I went to these kind of sizes, just didn't hold up. So then I went, okay, and by 2006, I was still determined to figure out how to get aerial shots. So I rented a Hasselblad with a phase back. And then it was a 40 megabyte phase back, and I rented a helicopter, shot with it, and I also shot with my 4x5 on that same shoot. I said, I'm going to do a side-by-side here.
That was the AMARC
The AMARC.
project.
Exactly.
AMARC.
AMARC.
Project in the desert.
Right. So that's when my very first, when I rented that camera, and I shot the film and I shot digital. I went back to the lab. I looked at both of them. I looked what I got, and without question, digital won, hands down. And that was when I said, I'm going digital. But it was only until I couldn't match the quality with film that I jumped. So I'd already been running a lab for 14 years in digital, but still shooting analog. And then I'd drum scan the analog 4x5, and then write it back out onto, at that time it was a Chimera printer. There was a LightJet, Chimera, and Durst printers that could take your digital files and write them back onto analog paper, the same paper you enlarge onto, but now you can write onto it with with the digital data. And so that's how I did my prints from probably 2000, and I bought the Chimera in 2005, and I made Chimera prints for almost 15 years before I then went to now full digital cameras and direct digital onto Epson paper. So that's what this is. So this is a 150 megapixel camera printed directly onto Epson material. And so in a way, I would say this surpasses 8x10. So the kind of what you can get from the high-end machines and digital cameras today and the printers today, I would say exceed what you could do with an 8x10 and then larger 20 years earlier.
Well, two hands at the back. Should it be the taller or the shorter?
Can you talk about the emotional impact of doing this kind of work? Because it seems you're away from home a lot of the time. You have to track a lot of very heavy equipment and then see things that are maybe not as pleasant as nature and like the ideals that you described earlier. Thank you.
Yeah, I would say that that moment of kind of coming to terms with all of that was really when I went in 2000, when I went to Bangladesh and saw what was happening in Bangladesh. And I also, for the first time, went to India, and I was in an industrial town called Makrana, and I did a whole series on stone quarries in India, and really got to kind of see poverty and humanity on a level that I'd never really comprehended. And then looking at the shipbreaking yards, and I think to me there was a lot of kind of grief in that moment, and there was and clearly then I went to China, and I just saw the scale of China, and I just saw it as this runaway train, and there's no stopping it. There's just going to be nothing that can get in the way of it, and it's going to become a consumer culture, and it will need energy on a level that it's almost incomprehensible. So I had this dread, and I had two young children, so and I'm thinking, oh my God, like we're on this trajectory that I don't see how we're ever going to like make it, as a species. I thought we were definitely like, and China was really a shock too, the scale of what was happening in China. So that was all 2000, 2001, too. And it was rough, it was hard, and it was pretty hard on my family as well. My marriage didn't survive, 2005. But I think what's happened, and what happens when you go through a kind of like, witnessing things at this scale and with that eye. I mean, people go to these places, but I'm there looking at it, I'm staring at it, I'm looking right at it. And so I think what really began to occur to me, and what happens in all things, is you try to take that pain and move it into meaning. And I really felt that by bringing these things forward, by being the kind of medium through those worlds and to bring it into the urban world, was a way to direct, the kind of pain and the trajectory that I was kind of foreseeing that all of this is going, and worrying for not just my children, but the future generations, and going, how's this going to work out? Because what I was looking at seemed so daunting, and I couldn't see anything that could slow it down, and nothing has slowed it down. So China is now the largest manufacturer in the world, and although they are now also the largest supplier of solar panels and wind turbines and batteries and electric cars as well. So the world is changing rapidly. And I don't think it's hopeless, but it is hard to hold on to hope without feeling that you're just being a bit naive. But at the same time, I do believe that making the films and making the multimedia projects and the exhibitions, the books, all of it is to really try to, connect us, that there is something going on. And I'm always encouraged when the work is used in schools and primary schools, universities, because I think they can be brought into the educational system, and they're not indictments. They are, I think, like almost Rorschach tests. They become inflection points for conversations. What do you see? What do you think this means? And then through like inquiry-based learning, which I believe that is the best way to teach, and allow the students to question what it is that they're being shown, and to have conversations about them in an open way about what is it that is going on there. And you can look at a picture like that, and that's First Nations land, and then that's Scottsdale and the suburb of Scottsdale bumping up against a reservation, and it's it really, in one image, it really tells a story. And you can see there's, it's Phoenix. There's no water there, but every house has got a pool. There's greenery and there's all of that. So you see what technology, the internal combustion engine, and human will and desire can convert a desert into a paradise. And that's because we can pump water into there. We can drill for water. We can redirect water from the Colorado River. We're planting things, we're building homes with air conditioning, and we have a pool nearby. So yeah, you can take the desert and turn it into paradise. And yes, there's a natural impact on that, but in that way, again, the image can really, we can talk about that, but you can sit there and look at that and it just tells a story.
We have time for one more question. And it's the person who flew in.
Yes, yes, you flew in
you.
from Nelson, right?
Yes, yes. Thank you so much. This is quite amazing. Yes, I just flew in for this talk tonight, and I wanted my granddaughter to be a big part of this because of, the message you're bringing forth. And I would love to ask something that is nonlinear. You're dealing with nonlinear and linear, and you're recording these polarities. And I'm wondering, as you have gone through this for 40 years, you have been dealing with the consciousness of Earth. It's a live, breathing entity, and seeing the polarity of unconsciousness with humanity, and how this is, how you have evolved through this on a conscious level. Like, do you feel a real communion and a oneness with Earth as a live entity? I'd love for you to share on that.
Yeah, I mean, I would say that, and I still, to this day, I take my daughters, and I go to some of my favorite places, on Crown Land, and pitch a tent and go catch a fish for dinner, and really kind of, again, reconnect and, with that place. Because I've always kind of ended up, it's interesting because in my, when I was growing up, and my father was a difficult dad. I would say it wasn't easy with him, and he was displaced. From at 16, he had to leave his home and then was swept up into the war and never got the chance to live his life out the way he wanted. So there was a bit of bitterness in him too. I could tell, and I knew it, but I didn't. But then I was at the other side of that bitterness. But during that troubled time with him, and then he was dying and everything, that I was fairly religious, and we were grown up Catholic, and I became an altar boy when I was 9, 10, 11, and I really wanted to kind of find something bigger to kind of grab onto and to believe in, and to say that there is something that comes to terms with the kind of cyclical and what seemed to be a challenging and difficult kind of life to be at that point, living at that point. But then he passed away, and then I kind of left religion. There was some, I really liked the sisters, but I just had difficulty with the Catholic Church at that time, and I was asking all kinds of questions that I didn't like the answers to, and then I started thinking about nature, and my dad did introduce me to that, and I loved it. And I saw that there was an answer in it that was more grounded, and then I started understanding, Darwinism and the fact that we are of the earth, that we are just from the earth and of the earth, and I started to believe that was a better way to go to nature as a source of the greater thing, and we are part of that thing. And then I started to believe that the biggest mistake we did was to call it nature, because it put it outside of us. It's over there. It's outside of us, but rather than it being part of us. And all First Nations, you would say that nature would be always part of them. They wouldn't be separated from it. But we have separated ourselves from nature, which I think has always been a very dangerous thing. So, but again, having that kind of looking to that as the larger thing to pay attention to, because all life springs forth from it, and we depend on it. And we depend on the bees. I mean, 40% of what we eat, has to be pollinated. So we better take care of the bees, because we're not going to be able to have enough food to feed humans if we don't. So these things are all interconnected, and so to me, the richness came back, and the kind of North Star was to just say that nature is the greater force that gives me a kind of a compass point, and that's why I've always owned a piece of property in the country with the forest, and I've always managed that forest and taken care of a forest. I wanted to, then that's where I'd always go after these long trips to Bangladesh, and I'd go and I'd just sit in the forest and just sit there and think about it and just be back there again. And that was where I would again recenter my my systems to kind of like go on to the next.
Ed, you've given a lot of yourself this evening, and I want to thank you very much.
Thank you.